Okay, well, hello and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to unbelievably the final instalment of the Institute for Northern Studies public seminar series. It's great to see familiar names in the audience today, and a warm welcome to those who are joining us for the first time. For those who don't know, my name is Dr. Andrew Lind, and it's my great pleasure to be chairing these seminars. And before I introduce today's speaker, as is custom, I've got a couple of very quick and very boring technical points that I just need to note before proceeding. The first is just to make everyone aware, if the scary robot voice didn't give it away, that today's session is being recorded and that it will be accessible alongside all of our previous seminars on the Institute for Northern Studies YouTube channel. After the paper, we'll hold a Q&A session, and if you have a question at any point during the presentation, feel free to post it via the chat box on your screen. And we would ask that you use the chat function rather than the Q&A function, just because it's easier for myself to keep an eye on all the questions as they're coming in, and it just means that we're not going to miss anyone's question out. And when you're sending those questions in via the chat box, please make sure that you address them to all panelists to allow Uli to also see them. Speaking of which, today it's an honour to introduce our very own Professor Ullrich Kockel, whose accomplishments are so numerous that it was difficult to condense them down into a brief introduction, but I'll give it a go nonetheless. Uli is a Professor of Creative Ethnology here at the Institute for Northern Studies, but before coming to UHI, Uli had positions throughout Europe, including at Leeds Polytechnic, Galway, Liverpool, Cork, West of England University, Ulster and Heriot-Watt, in addition to visiting professorships at VMU in Lithuania and the Latvian Academy of Culture. His internationally renowned research on culture, heritage, ethnology and anthropology has been disseminated through dozens of publications in various languages and formats. He has commented upon a range of different topics and themes, from identity formation to sustainable tourism. And it's on those two themes that I think Uli will be commenting upon today in his paper, Across the Fundamental Field in the European North, Ethnological Perspectives on Indigenous Knowledge and Land-Based Learning for Sustainability. Welcome, Uli.
Thank you, Andrew. It's always interesting to listen to the ways people introduce ones in these occasions. But anyway, I'm not sure how famous or whatever. But it's a long time since I wrote the abstract for this seminar. And as always with these endeavors, things move on. And so what I promised to do in the seminar may not quite be what you're going to get today, but that's just the way life works. But most of the points I will cover in some way or another. So I will be talking about Geopoetics of Kenneth White and a little bit about the topology of Jeff Malpas. I'll be talking about human ecological relationships. I'll talk about the European North, Indigeneity and Indigenous, being Indigenous to place will also feature. Keith Basso features in almost everything that I say and write, so he'll be there as well. I mentioned reference to examples in the Scotland and the Baltic region, and they will be there too. But rather than getting a large amount of detail about specific case studies, I'll use those examples more to illustrate questions and approaches. And given the limited time that the seminar offers, I'll concentrate on the approaches too, rather than the final detail of those examples, which are drawn from past and, I was going to say future, they can't be drawn from future field work yet, but from ideas about where I might be going in field work in the future. So that's basically the idea and outline insofar as there is a structure. But exploring where North is and what it means is a key part of what we do at the Institute for Northern Studies, specifically named in that way. And Scotland and the Baltic states are not usually subsumed under that label North, if reference to the European. North means that you expect to hear about Sami reindeer herders and Icelandic whalers. You'll be disappointed. But Scotland and the Baltic states arguably do belong to the North, in the sense that Edinburgh lies further north than Copenhagen, which is the capital of an indisputably Nordic country. Lerwick lies further north than the capital of the Åland Islands, Mariehamn, which is between Sweden and Finland. And Klaipeda and Riga on the Baltic, on the other side of the Baltic, are somewhere in between, so the east is also the north. And over the years, I've looked at issues of place and landscape and belonging in a range of political contexts across Europe, and the focus over the last decade or so being, apart from Central Europe, being largely on Scotland and Lithuania. And the theoretical perspective from which I have done this, and continue to do this, is very much shaped by topology and geopoetics. Now, topology I take literally. I don't mean by that the mathematical sub-branch of mathematics that deals with the representation of dots in various graphical formats, but it's topos is the place, and logy obviously is the knowledge of place, and it's this that I refer to when I talk about topology. And one of the books that has shaped that inquiry is Jeff Malpas's Heidegger's Topology, Being, Place, World, where Malpas argues that an engagement with place, which is explicit, especially in Heidegger's later work, informs Heidegger's thought as a whole. And what guides Heidegger's thinking, Malpas writes, is a conception of philosophy's starting point, or finding ourselves already there. So we need to think about the there and what that is and what that means. The situatedness in the world, in a particular place. And Heidegger's concepts of being and place, Malpas argues, are inextricably bound together. And Malpas follows the development of this topology in Heidegger's thought through the three stages that he identifies. The earlier period from the 1910s and 20s, when Being and Time was written, centered on the meaning of being. And then you have the middle period of the 30s and 40s, which is centered on the truth of being, and the late period from the mid-40s onwards, when the place of being comes to the fore in the analysis. It's also worth pointing out that Malpas challenges the widely repeated arguments that connect Heidegger's notion of place and belonging to his entanglement with Nazism, which is a topic for an entirely different day and a different seminar. Now, the significance of Heidegger as a thinker of place, claims Malpas, lies not only in Heidegger's own investigations, but also in the way that spatial and topographic thinking has flowed from Heidegger's work into that of other key thinkers over the past 60 years. And it's quite amazing to see how many anthropologists and geographers in particular have been influenced by Heidegger's thought in that regard. And one such thinker is Kenneth White, the Scottish-born poet who lives now in Brittany, who developed the figure of the intellectual nomad as free from cultural and scientific limitations and conventions, and whose mind roams all areas of the earth without a fixed goal, but always in search of expanding his or her own knowledge and ability to know. Now, this figure of the intellectual nomad appeared as early as the 19th century. You might think of Arthur Rimbaud, for example, and Kenneth White travels with it from Celticism to Far Eastern philosophies, from German Romanticism to Russian nihilism, from Thoreau in the Forests of America to Nietzsche in the Engadin and Heidegger in the Black Forest. So it's quite a wide-ranging compass that he draws on. And to quote him on the topic of the intellectual nomad, he says, "In the intellectual nomad, erudition and wandering mix, but this wandering around is fruitful and invigorating for the civilization-weary intellect. And it's interesting to note the revival in ethnology and ethnography in recent years of the rambling approach to research, the wandering about the place, which was there in the 19th century already and then has been partially forgotten and then reshaped and revived. And you see a lot of it coming back into use now. And of course, there is the critique from a scientific point of view that this isn't proper rigorous method and analysis, but we may talk about that later in the Q&A maybe. And another quote from Kenneth White: if we try to continue in thought and not to forget that the outermost deepest thinking may not be realized in philosophical discourse, but in the exact and extravagant language of a poem, we try to preserve the possibility for the mind to inhabit the earth in a more free-thinking way. And it's interesting that in one of the recent publications of the two thinkers that I just mentioned is a joint book which was produced by Edinburgh University Press last year, which is called The Fundamental Field, and that's where, you might guess by now, is where the title from, or part of the title of my seminar comes from. In the wake of the poet Hölderlin's famous exclamation, "What you want is a world," Heidegger, in an important reference for both, who's an important reference for both Malpas and White, speaks of the worlding of the world, das Welten der Welt, and makes statements such as the world never is, it is always a becoming, bad English translation for Welt ist nie, sondern weltet. Now, in the fundamental field, the term itself refers to this worlding and to the insights that, as contemporary history indicates, unless we get at something fundamental, a question of founding and grounding, that world is going to become more and more beset by simplistic fundamentalisms of various types, all of them destructive of living thought and of any kind of integrated existence. And on that point, White writes in this book, The Fundamental Field, what I see is the whole enterprise, which involves landscape history and culture, is the attempt, while insisting on the significance of place, the necessity of emplacement to get beyond anything like regional thematic, small-minded localism, Kuthi homeliness. If the heart is present, any dwelling in sentimentality is out. The accent is on the place of mind, geistige Heimat in German. And if there is a search for identity, it is new identity. That is, it takes place outside the search for roots. Now, the notion of and search for roots indicates radical action. Radical, of course, is about going to and coming from the roots. Now, human ecology, which is the study and practice of relationships between the natural and the social environment, has gained prominence as scholars seek more effectively to engage with pressing global concerns. In the past 70 years or so, most human ecology has skirted the fringes of geography, sociology, and biology. Radical human ecology, by contrast, explores the power of indigenous and traditional peoples' epistemologies, both to critique and to complement insights from modernity and postmodernity, such as those of the philosopher Ernst Bloch, who's shown here smoking his ubiquitous pipe. And Bloch had this concept in his magnum opus, the Prinzip Hoffnung, the principle of hope, where he talks about den Umbau der Welt zur Heimat. And one could translate that as the reconstruction of the world as homeland, but homeland is a very poor rendering of it in terms of all the connotations that it bears or doesn't bear. So I would suggest one could also translate it in a mixture of English and Gaelic as the reconstruction of the world as duches. Now, it shows that an intercultural and transdisciplinary approach is required. This is human ecology I'm thinking about. The demands of our times require a kind of scholarship of ontological depth, an approach that can not just debate issues, but also address questions of practice and of meaning. Now, we could spend an entire lecture deconstructing this image, but today we won't. The image is reminiscent of Caspar David Friedrich's Man in the Mountains, which you're probably familiar with, who gazes across the clouds and the tips of the mountains. Landscape as a sublime, as a backdrop to what exactly? Now, where we see wild and untamed nature, we're actually looking at shaped reality, resulting from economic, social, and political pressures as interpreted largely by people in positions of power to affect such a shaping, having first scoped the land's potential to be suitably transformed. In places such as the Scottish Highlands, that landscaping has forced many people from the land of their ancestors, forcing them to escape the new landscape. Now that the desert created by the clearances has become a tourist attraction, and this transient land use often stands in the way of other more sustainable forms of development, supporting local communities. Its continued pursuit lays a veneer over the land that blocks a deeper connection of humans to place in all its layers. Now, issues of place and landscape and belonging have been critically examined in two distinct ways with different, often confused political contexts. One is with international organizations like UNESCO, often finding themselves caught in between. So one of the tropes, the key tropes of indigeneity remains controversial. On the one hand, you have the designation of colonized peoples living both in and out of place, in particular by contrast with their colonizers. On the other hand, and the idea of indigeneity is and has historically been claimed as a key badge by populist movements of various political orientation, left, right, and center. There's not many in the center, mostly on the wings and the left and the right. A third aspect is the growing association of indigeneity with more or less picturesque cultural fixations that are furthered by factors that range from an internal exotic stereotype, what Bausinger many years ago called the Binnenexotik, to well-meaning, well-intended measures of cultural protection, like the UNESCO listings of intangible cultural heritage, for example. Some international networks, like the Alliance for Intergenerational Resilience, with whom I've been working for some years, have begun to address the tensions and contradictions that arise from all of this by exploring what indigeneity means in different places and at different times, and how it is expressed and by whom. The significant, the most challenging in that whole endeavor is the question of legitimacy. On what grounds is such indigeneity founded, and whose world is worlding in this process that is being observed and described and analyzed here? Now, the answers are complicated by the history of displacement in terms of both physical and metaphorical movements of people out of their place of belonging. Now, whether we're dealing with mass flight and expulsion during or after violent conflicts like Ukraine at the moment, or with rural-urban migration within and across various boundaries, or with even internal exile of various description, there's a large number of people nowadays who live in some form of diaspora, which literally means in the other, and by implication, the wrong place. In academia, we're rather well used to analytical discourses that euphemize this to a greater or lesser extent by employing phrases like cosmopolitanism or transnationalism that gloss over the fundamental disconnect that affects many displaced people, whether their trauma finds immediate discernible expression or remains largely hidden in their subconscious until surfacing in response to some external or internal impulse. There's now a growing body of research on the effects of such trauma into later generations who did not actually experience the trauma itself directly, which indicates that relationships between people and place and the impacts of having such relationships severed remains quite poorly understood by our Western science. And where I first came across that literature was in the context of work I've been doing on the children and grandchildren of refugees and expellees from the Second World War, Germans from the central and eastern parts of Europe that were driven from their homes at the end of the Second World War. And there's quite a lot of literature about the intergenerational trauma of the second, third, and fourth generation as it is now, which is makes quite interesting reading. That realization has led to a growing interest in both indigenous methods of understanding the world and in ways of potentially becoming indigenous. Well, it's needless to say that the latter is particularly strong among non-indigenous people. And this has produced debates that, while necessary and generally helpful, are often acrimonious and sometimes ridiculous. They often center on the idea of language as a suitably non-racial and therefore by definition non-racist criterion. We might want to talk about that in the Q&A. But as soon as place enters the debate's vocabulary, the spectre of blood and soil ideologies often tends to be invoked, as we recently saw in the pages of the Scottish Affairs in a very interesting exchange. While the populist use of indigeneity rightly sounds alarm bells, it is misleading to tar all reference to the land grounding and so on with the broad brush of fascism. Sadly, it doesn't help, of course, that this defense argument it doesn't help the defense argument that the philosopher who has been the most influential on thinking about these issues has been a certain Martin Heidegger with his jargon of authenticity, as Adorno called it. But that's a challenge that those who draw on his work will have to face and live with and respond to. By the way, what Adorno refers to as authenticity is Heidegger's concept of Eigentlichkeit, which we might explore the difference between the two, but again, that would require a separate seminar, as would a discussion of the gratuitous quote that I have here on this slide, which we might come back to later. So let's move on for the moment. Most of us use the term sense of place often and rather carelessly when we think of nature, landscape, or home. And our sense of place, however, comes not just from this individual experiences, but from our cultures. And in his book, Wisdom Sits in Places, Keith Basso, who is a farmer first and an anthropologist second, as he describes himself, explores place, places, landscape, and language, and what they mean to a particular group of people. And in his case, that's the Western Apache in Arizona. Now, Arizona is not a northern country, except in relation to Mexico, and because it is in North America, but that's for another story. He gives in his wonderful ethnographic work, he gives us to understand something about the sacred and the indivisible nature of words and place. And this is, as Scott Momaday says, it's a universal equation, a balance in the universe. And he goes on to say that place may be the first of all concepts, it may be the oldest of all words. Now there's an interesting thought to be considered by linguists, for example. But Basso does is he lifts the veil on the most elementary poetry of human experience, which is the naming of the world. Place names are quite significant, of course, as folklore scholars will tell us and confirm. And through Basso's eyes, we can see the spirit of a quite remarkable people and their land and their relationship to that land. And when we then look away from the text, we see our own world maybe with with fresh eyes, and that's the real value of this particular case study. Now, seeing the world afresh, learning from and of and about the land-based learning is a concept that's come to us from Indigenous studies, really, but it also coincides and connects with the environmental movement with various other sources. And it leads to a key point of understanding and trying to understand who we are and where we come from. So there is the development of a land-based pedagogy, which ties in with what one might call Western approaches of outdoor learning. That would be, again, an interesting conjunction to explore, but not today. But every culture is connected to its environment. Indigenous cultures have lived off their land for many centuries. And so traditional knowledge and connections are very deeply rooted in quite a practical sense. And cultures have traditional ways of using land and what is upon it, and using the land to make things such as shelter and tools to aid in tasks for living. And they have traditional diet that includes immense knowledge of plants, animals and their properties, etc. Traditional stories that tell the generations about ecological connections, significance of symbolism that connect the culture to the land through various rituals and so on. And by observing the land and how the land speaks, cultures have learned how to move with and respect it. Now, Indigenous cultures have a common belief that the earth is alive and that all things are related. And the respect that these cultures teach us to show is the spirit that we give to all things. When we acknowledge their spirit, when we communicate with it and respect it, the land, what we sometimes might call nature, or for want of a better term, with the Western phrase, the environment, which is around us, becomes alive. And the respect that we show to other things is embedded in the ways that our cultural groups have been taught for generations. This is from an Indigenous perspective. Culture teaches us how to communicate with all things, including the land. Before we can see how a relationship with the land is fostered, of course, we must understand culture in a way that is encompassing of traditional knowledge and belief systems and doesn't rule them out as non-scientific or for whatever other reason, as used to be the case. And it's interesting to see in that context that there is a strong push now by the AHRC to encourage the collaboration of Western in inverted commas maybe, and Indigenous approaches. So with that in mind, let's take a quick look at some vignettes from the fundamental field. And I begin with highlighting two case studies that I hope to look at more closely over the next year or so in the context of a research project on Indigenous knowledge and intergenerational resilience. Now, one of them is the Shieling project, which I have a passing familiarity with and hope to explore further because to me, it's a very shining example in the Scottish context of this land-based pedagogy that I was just talking about, because that is really what the project is about. It's bringing together the history, the connection with the land, the Gaelic culture, rural skills, and all of that, connecting the past to the future through a presence that is being made increasingly aware of where it comes from, both literally and metaphorically. It's a community enterprise working with schools and teachers and local community to explore the past of the landscape and help to shape a more resilient future and a more sustainable future. What they say about themselves is that we can learn a lot from the Shieling tradition about ourselves, our food, heritage, sustainability. And in the past, in the summer, young people used to help take livestock up the hill to the Shieling. Common transhumance practice across many parts of Europe. So they're camping out there in the small bothies and learning about the world beyond the village. And they're trying to recover that mode of learning through the Shieling projects, which makes it quite an interesting case study in the context of my interest in place and belonging. A slightly different, or very different in some ways, approach is the Cateran Eco Museum. The Eco Museums, I think, were pioneered in France, I think, originally, but then spread as a movement quite vigorously at one time. We don't have that many in the UK real eco museums rather than open air museums, which is a different category. But Cateran is quite a shining example of how this can be done really well. It's a way of reading the land in deep time, so to speak. It's a museum without walls. All the sites are outside in the open, and they range from Pictish standing stones to farmsteads to textile mills and whatever buildings, but also pathways, trails that are leading you through the landscape, including the connection with the Caterans themselves, which were Highland clan warriors who came to be associated with cattle raiding. So it's basically an activity landscape through which you can learn about history, you can learn about culture, you learn about the land and people's connection with the land. It has an educational program, it has a resident poet, etc. So it's quite a diversified, multifaceted approach of connecting with not just the actual place, but through the place with the wider world, with the connections that the place had with Scotland beyond the region, but also with the world further afield. So again, this is an area, a case study that I'm looking forward to getting into a bit more over the next year or two. Looking the other direction, work that I have done in the past, I've been engaged with Western Lithuania for quite some time, since about 10, 12 years, and have done various smaller case studies on location. Now, the first one I'm going to talk about is the Curonian Spit, which all of it actually is a World Heritage Site, recognized by UNESCO. And when we look at the spit in terms of like deep time, historical time, history of colonization, if you wish, it's very difficult to talk about an indigenous population there, and the same has been said about places like Ireland, because people have moved across this landscape so frequently in different directions that it's very difficult to find traces of who was here first in terms of the culture. The Prussians and Curonians, Prutzen and Kuren in German, the Baltic tribes basically, are the first in historical times, never mind prehistory. After that, these were Baltic peoples coming from the east. Then came the Teutonic Knights and some German settlers. From the 1400s, more Germans arrived and some Lithuanians, and from the 1500s, the religious state of the Teutonic Knights became a secular state, which was aligned with and later incorporated into the emerging Germany. It was an international territory from 1918 to 23, and then annexed by Lithuania until 1939, and then incorporated into Lithuania after World War II. Now, the Prussians and Curonians were colonizers when they first arrived, so there were other people there before. Then the Lithuanians rivaled the Teutonic Knights with the Teutonic Knights, many of whom were in today's terms actually not German, but Swiss, Austrian, Czech, Italian, or even French. But the Lithuanians vied with them for domination of the other Baltic tribes. So that there's multiple levels and tiers of colonization going on here, which makes it very difficult to discern who may or may not count for indigenous. And of course, after World War II, the entire population was pretty much displaced, and the resident population was driven out and then replaced by people from other parts of Lithuania and even further afield in the Soviet Union. So what we're looking at here is the environmental heritage of place. Nidden is the main place on the Curonian Spit, and you see in the background the Great Dune, which is one of the famous formations of the landscape there. The Curonian Spit is a unique geological feature, a very vulnerable landscape, but it's also at the same time humanly sculpted. So it's not a pure natural landscape. It's a highly managed landscape. On the bottom left, you see a picture of the entrance to what is described by in the tourist literature on the Spit as an ethnographic graveyard, which I find a very interesting description. And you see the bilingual sign going in. On the left, you have German in the old German script, and on the right, you have Lithuanian. The cemetery is very much an item of landscape art, in the sense that it won't go into the details now. We can do that in the Q&A, but basically it combines real graves with artificial ones. And there has been a dispute about whose graveyard is it anyway, which reveals interesting local power struggles and power relations. So that's one example of the cultural connection of the people there with the land and what stories are being told. On the top right-hand corner, you can see the shell, the Jacob's shell, the Pomeranian Way of St. James. And the naming of it is interesting because this is nowhere near Pomerania, but it's on the Pomeranian way of the Camino that leads ultimately to Galicia. And this is, the plaque is on the outside of the newly built Catholic church, because the original population, of course, in the Curonian Spit was Protestant, well, predominantly 99% Protestant, whereas the population of Lithuania is practically 99% Catholics. The Protestant is a very small minority, but the Protestant church is still there, and interesting things are going on there, in that the Protestant church was used by the Russians as a storehouse for whatever they needed to store. And when the Protestant church was reopened, rededicated, renovated after the fall of communism, people started singing German Protestant hymns in there, even though they don't speak German, but they still had the songbooks, and they're doing this as part of connecting with the place. Even though they're now in the second and third generation immigrants, they're practically from there. So what's going on there is quite an interesting question. And I still haven't found an answer to it, but I'm thinking about the questions that raises. The second case study, moving on to the mainland, is the mainland more generally, Western Lithuania, or Lithuania Minor, as it is historically often referred to. After 1945, as I said earlier, the population was practically completely replaced by migrants from other parts of Lithuania and further afield, Kazakhstan and places like that. But there were always traces of the German past, and there's a few of them here. You see the Prussian military barracks on the left, which are now housing the University of Klaipėda, as well as the German consulate, about halfway down the front of houses there. And the use and renovation and use of this Prussian barracks is quite an interesting aspect of place relationships. And then two places where the connection is practically, the heritage is absent. Top right, on the top, you see the site of the former St. John's Church, and the outline of the church has been etched with box, a little hedge of box that follows the outline of where the church used to stand. And the bell, the great bell, is where the spire used to be in that arrangement, and hidden by the great bell is a wooden cross that signifies where the high altar used to be. There are still Protestant services being held in that area. You see the house that is kind of lit up by the sun in the background. That is where the Protestant pastor lives, and they have a big room downstairs where once a month about 20 people gather for a service, which is a bit like the Lutheran congregation, German-speaking Lutheran congregations in other parts of the world, like we have one here in Edinburgh, which is similar in size and at their services. Now below is another fascinating example of landscape art, if you want to call it that. This was the site of the German military graveyard, which was bulldozed, ripped up and basically destroyed by the Red Army in the 1950s. And after the collapse of communism, it was decided that this site should be, I don't know what you want to call it, rededicated or whatever. But of course, it was impossible to locate the graves where they had been. So what they did locally was to create this kind of landscape culture where you have the 3 crosses of Golgotha and various copies of them sort of dotted around the place to give you the clear impression that this is a cemetery or a site of commemorating the dead, as it were. And there's an ensemble. There are other elements to it, of which I've picked just one there, which are the little grave slabs on the right. These are not actual graves, but they're grave slabs that have been removed from another graveyard in Panevėžys in the center of Lithuania. And they're mostly German graves, or gravestones. But there's 2 Russian ones there as well, which I find quite interesting. And I would like to talk to somebody in the German body that looks after war graves abroad, who were involved in and instigated actually, and then were involved in relocating these memorials from Panevėžys, from the battlefield in Panevėžys, to this newly created dead landscape, as one might call it, in Klaipėda, as part of the memorial that was being created there. And again, this is a connection, not just an honoring of the dead, but it's also a connection with the lost, the disappeared German heritage of the land, and it raises a lot of interesting questions for that. There's also a German presence since the fall of communism, which is quite interesting and concrete, and I have no pictures of that. One is the secondary school, the grammar school as it is now, Hermann Sudermann Gymnasium, a German name named after a famous German author from the region. So there is actually a German-speaking secondary school now, and because there is hardly any German population, these kids are encouraged by their parents or by their own interest or whatever to do their secondary education through immersion in German. And most of their teaching is through German. They do the German Abitur, which is the university qualification exam at the end of their studies. And they have quite extensive exchanges with Germany. So there is this connection between the new population of the area and the no longer their population, which is quite interesting in terms of ideas that we have here in Scotland about resettling and recreating new people moving into an area and then connecting with the place, connecting with the land. And there's the Simon Dach House and various other institutions that foster and look after the heritage of place, as it were, in there. Now, I'm approaching all these places from a perspective that built on a 3-step cycle of inquiry that I developed some years ago and have been trying to hone improve since. And the starting point is a grounding in a sensitive topography. Topography meaning the description of and the learning about place, and that's kind of the bedrock of it all, which is why it's at the bottom of the cycle here. And that feeds into the development of a respectful topology and understanding of the specificity of place, which I also described in an earlier paper that I wrote as applied regional science. This is sort of focus on not just is it interesting what we can learn here, but what is it good for? What do we do with this knowledge that we gain? What's it all for? And in the practice of that, of describing and learning about the place, we develop a kind of a cultural philosophy, an informed spiritual, what I call the toposophy. And toposophy, of course, with a nod to Keith Basso, is place wisdom, the wisdom that sits in places, topos and Sophia. Now, this approach recognizes the community-based co-creation of place as a fundamental actuality, and ethnology in that context becomes consequently about understanding people in the places that they make, or not, as it were, in the present, from their respective pasts that they draw on, and for the common future that they envisage. And this is indeed, as Kenneth White argues, outside the search for roots, at least as these are conceived by the salvage ethnology of earlier generations. They are not the kind of roots that are at stake here. Its intuition is rather more like the not yet, the forward historicity, difficult word, that is expressed in Ernst Bloch's postulate of a world reconstructed into ducas. Maybe this is a good point to start the Q&A. Thank you for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Uli. So much there to think about and to mull over. I'll open the chat box up now if anyone would like to post any questions. And I'll just give people a chance to type away. So we've got a question from Kockel. Thank you, Ullrich, for your fascinating talk. May I ask you to comment on the sociological concept of emergent features, collective phenomena collaboratively created by individuals, but not reducible to individuals, in the context of the pervasive threat of societal erasure of the collective aspects of indigenous knowledge, and in particular the anxiety that an avoidance of societal erasure may see a focus on ingenuity, descending into neo-pastoralism.
God, how much time have you got? There's a lot there, and also it's probably a question of language, because there's so much out there to read that I'm not terribly au fait with sociological concepts per se until they make it into a handbook. So this idea of the emergent features is interesting, and what you put in brackets says it explains it quite nicely. I would probably describe that slightly different with different words, but that's neither here nor there. Where do I start? Maybe I start with the neo-pastoralists. When we talk about indigeneity, it's quite frequent that we see associations with, we see it in a rural context. Yeah? So that's what the descent into neo-pastoralism is about. What we're forgetting is that most indigenous people actually no longer live in a rural context. They live in cities. And one of the questions that we've been asking ourselves and the people that we liaise with in the context of the Alliance for Intergenerational Resilience is, can you actually be indigenous in an urban context at all? And what does that mean, and how does that work? Because the image we have of indigenous people is what Floyd Westerman in one of his songs described as our feathered friends. In other words, like illustriously clad people wearing strikingly non-suit and tie type, non-Western outfits, and running around in the grass in the forest and on the plains and whatever, and sometimes farming and sometimes not. But it's very much a rural image that we have of indigeneity, even not even rural, the rainforest, for example, Lapland, that's where the indigenous people live. They don't live in London or Edinburgh, but yet most of them do. So I think the descent of indigeneity into neo-pastoralism is not something one should particularly anxious about. There are other issues to be looked at in more priority, I would say. The idea of social erosion, especially in the context of things that are co-created, collaboratively created, obviously by individuals, because it's always individuals who take up the tools that make things, but are then become kind of like folklore, become common property and are no longer reducible to an author in the Western sense of an author. But that common experience is also challenged in other contexts, not just here with indigenous knowledge, but I mean the most striking example of that challenge has been, in my mind, both the positive and the negative reaction to Tim Hardin's paper many years ago in the 1960s about the tragedy of the commons, which basically analyzes the commons and the tragedy in terms of individual actors. And that's only one way of looking at it, but the commons, it's called the commons for a reason, because it's something that is done in common. It's done by a group, and it's not reducible to individuals. And some people who have critiqued Hardin's analysis have critiqued it precisely on that point, because he's reducing something to individual actions and motivations, which is actually not reducible to these individual actions and motivations. But anyway, it's a big topic, and it's a good point to raise. I'm not sure how good or bad my answer or response to it was. It wasn't really an answer, more of a response. But it's a topic that we could possibly organize a little workshop on, either in Solmorostig or in the INS, and we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, Andrew Jennings has actually posted another question underneath that links into some of these perhaps issues with coming up with kind of hard and fast definitions. Because Andrew said, I was interested in your comments that children of people removed from their ancestral land still feel they belong to it in some sense. This brought to mind the concept of canalis, or homesickness, including for a place you've never actually been. Have you compared the Gallic diaspora with the Baltic Germans?
Not yet, although that is certainly something that might come and happen in the foreseeable future. I was interested in that concept of, I've lost the chat now. Oh yeah, back again. I was interested in the concept of Kianalas, however you pronounce that. The homesickness, including for a place you've never actually been, because when I started, not just before I actually started researching the Baltic states, but I started visiting there in 25, and then a couple of years later, and I started the research in 2011, but somewhere in between I gave a conference paper, How Can I Feel Homesick for a Place I've Never Been? Which in which I reflected on my relationship with Western Lithuania, because when I arrived there, I knew the place. I'd never been there before, but I had the strong feeling that this is so familiar. This is a place I have strong links with, and I don't know why. As to this day, I don't know why in the Western sense of knowing, but I have an idea or two about where it might come from, and it has to do with storytelling and with oral heritage and the way things happened in our family and what happened when and where and so on. And I can possibly trace this, but none of the people that I would need to talk to are alive anymore, so that makes it a bit difficult. But it's interesting that there is actually a word that captures that.
Can I ask about the kind of the definition of indigenous? And obviously that comes with political baggage that almost adds another layer of complexity. But is there a danger of exclusion in terms of who we define as indigenous, or when we're talking about indigenous cultures in various places? Because I was struck by your examples there of from Pomerania of these communities that coming from places where there's been successive waves of migration and immigration and population shifts and fluctuations, but there is a continuing sense of these people being indigenous to that area and a place of belonging and ownership of that area. Is there any way to get around these kind of nuances and complexities when we're trying to define who is and isn't indigenous?
Well, that is actually a key question in the workshop I'm trying to organize in Perth in July.
You can flag that now then.
No, but in 2009 we founded the Place Wisdom Working Group in the International Society for Ethnology and Folklore, and they are organizing their inter-congress. So the congress is every 2 years, so in between the working groups have their own workshops, and they are doing one this year on precisely that question. Right. Because there is already several definitions of indigenous, including some of them enshrined in international law. And I don't have them to hand at the moment, but basically there are 3 or 4 different definitions. Some of them connect with how long you've been there, or the most widely used one is the people who occupied the land when the land was colonized. Now, if the land was colonized several times over, that doesn't really wash so easily. Yeah. And then there is the weakest one, which is in one sense perhaps stronger than we think, is self-definition. And along the lines of what became famous as the Bonn-Copenhagen Declaration in Schleswig between Denmark and Germany, where there had been internecine warfare for centuries. And then after the Second World War, the 2 governments concluded that you could not be challenged. If you said you were Danish in North Germany, then you were Danish, and that was that, end of story. So you become indigenous by that logic, by self-definition. Now that has caused endless problems in Finland, where people are moving into an area they have no connections with, buying up houses, etc., and becoming indigenous. Yeah. So, and then people started writing. One guy in the University of Rovaniemi in Lapland, and a guy in an English university, I forget which one, I wrote a book together about this phenomenon of becoming indigenous and how does it work and whatever. And then within indigeneity, there is the difference between capital I and small I. In other words, proper indigenous and not so proper indigenous. So there's a very heavy debate going on, and with the AIR, with the Alliance for Intergenerational Resilience, we're very much part of that debate and trying to put some light into the darkness that is there. And it's interesting to see. I mentioned the little spat, as it was actually in the pages of Scottish Affairs of about 6 months ago, or late last year, early this year, where in particular a former PhD student of mine, Ian McKinnon, was being attacked by some, I shall just without value judgment, saying Western scholars who didn't get that indigenous perspective that he was coming from, just didn't get it, and rubbished it and accused him of things that he didn't do and all. But anyway, this I was interested to see that clash between let's say an indigenous perspective and the Western perspective. And a lot of the debate was about inclusion, exclusion, and who is and is not a Gael, and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Is Gaelic identity predicated on the language or not, or what? And so, but there's no straight answers to that. It's a huge issue. It's a huge political problem and an academic problem.
Absolutely. It's so multifaceted that you get different answers depending on what angle you're looking at. But the issue is that obviously these are not self-contained, that there's overlap between them, and especially in the political side, that becomes quite messy quite quickly. Do we have any other questions from the audience? I'll just check the chat just now. Just let people type away.
I think so.
Yes, Ingrid, the webinar will be viewable on the actually the INS webpage, which is nested in the UHI webpage. There'll be a link there, and all our seminars are available on the INS YouTube channel as well. So if you just type it into YouTube, then it'll come up there. Okay, we do have time for another question if anyone has any. For another couple of minutes. Oh, there we go. So we have a question from Ryan. Just get this up there. So Ullrich, I really enjoyed what you have to say, particularly in the Baltic context. My people have been scattered up and down what is now Poland. And as has been the case for most Poles, leading to the situation where nobody except for some ethnic minorities really consider themselves indigenous anymore. The term is not used in any discourse in Poland that I'm aware of, and we are poorer for that.
Yeah, it's Poland is another one of those places where people have marched over and created an almighty ethnic melange, as it were. Some years ago, when I started writing about this, I came from a period of interest in border regions, and then gradually moved into what I'm doing now as my main focus. And part of that transition was reading a paper by a guy who's a Ukrainian born, but he lives in Canada now. I'm not sure what university he's at. Adrian Ivakev is his name. And he was writing about some exhibition in Lviv and trying to sort of represent art, represent European spirit and European culture through various pieces of art. And he was reflecting on that and talking about the context where the exhibition was being shown, which is, of course, part of the old Kresy region, which was Poland and now no longer is. And he referred to the people who in between the two world wars, in the census, when you couldn't ask, for some political reasons, you couldn't ask for their ethnic association. They were being asked questions about language and religion. And a lot of them used the phrase tuteishi, which means from here. So they answered the question, but like, what language do you speak? Well, the language from here, the local language. And so that term topology, of course, it has associations, and they're not always positive, shall we say. For example, the writer, famous writer whose name completely escapes me now, who was born in what is now Lithuania. He won the Nobel Prize. Can't think of him, but he was very critical, very dismissive of this idea of the topology, because he saw it as feeding into right-wing proto-peasant kind of ideologies, which to a large extent it does, and you find it bubbling up again on the political right. For example, the what's it called? Something for Deutschland, the AfD in Germany, for example, uses that kind of language. Czeslaw Milosz, exactly. Thank you. Yeah, that's an interesting concept. In the German, that's the hiesige. They're known and written about in academic literature as the hiesige. So the people who are from here.
I guess, again, that just underlines the complexity of this, and things like we can't use language as a marker. Because obviously when you're looking at places where you have all these different, almost melting pots of different languages, peoples, and cultures.
Yes. Seymour Reid just pointed out that some people had the problem I often have with WebEx, that it asks me for a password that I don't have.
Right. Yeah, I apologize to anyone that's not been able to get in. I don't understand why WebEx does this sometimes, but the recording will be made available on the INS webpage and on the INS YouTube channel. So unless anyone has a final question, I'll bring things to a close. I'll just, in case anyone's frantically typing. There's Andrew saying that UHI staff and students have to sign in with their UHI ID. We'll need to have a look at that, but that's we'll chase that up elsewhere. So all that's left for me to do before I bring things to a close is to thank Uli for an excellent paper and discussion, and to ask everyone to join me in the customary awkward round of applause through WebEx. But thank you very much, Uli, and thank you for giving the paper this afternoon.
Thank you for indulging me.
Not at all. And that unbelievably brings the public seminar series for this year to an end. So thank you to everyone who's joined us, and thank you to all of our fantastic speakers. Keep your eyes peeled in August for our new programme for the next academic year. But until then, make sure that you enjoy your summer, and we will see you in the autumn. Bye for now.
Indeed. Take care.